start off with. At this point, all of you should have seen some comments about your project report or project proposals. General point is that I'm happy. Many of you seem to be working on some rather interesting projects, so let's hope all of those work as well as we hope. Homework 2 grades and solutions should be available very soon. I'm hoping it will be today or tomorrow. Looks like it might end up being tomorrow. Homework 3, you are going to get more time for it because I'm going to talk about VC dimension today. It will be till 8th of March, Sunday. There were many questions about homework 3, not 2. Homework 3, about the first part of it. So there's been a fair bit of discussion on the on Canvas. Check it out if there are questions, especially with respect to, there seems to be some ambiguity with respect to how these parts can be broken and glued together, and almost all of you have your own preferred interpretation of it. I've been posting comments on Canvas, and let's kind of assume that whatever I've said on Canvas is the canonical interpretation. And if you feel strongly that your interpretation is better, then you should justify it, write an essay no longer than 10 pages describing why it's important. So just to confirm, for those of you who came in just now, the submission for homework 3 is the 8th of March, the submission date, by midnight. I think either me or the TAs will update Canvas to accept things. And then there's one more extra late day as always with a penalty. Another announcement is about the midterm. So I know all of you are eagerly waiting for the exam. So it's on next Wednesday. It's a closed book exam. There will be some sample questions that will be posted on the website. I'm hoping by the next lecture. In general, it will be like the non-programming parts of your homework, except slightly easier. It will also include things that we've covered in class. So far, I've tried to make the homework questions complementary to what you see in class. So we do something in class and you explore around it in your homeworks. In the midterm, obviously, we'll look at things that we've seen in the class and things that you may have seen in homeworks, and maybe some, if I'm feeling particularly nasty, I'll ask you to prove a theorem that I pick up in some paper. We'll see. There will be some sample questions that will be posted next by the next lecture. Any questions about any of these things? Yes?
So cover everything in class, not including this lecture.
Including this lecture.
Okay.
Yes. Oh yeah, we will cover everything until computational learning theory. So what that means is I will try to release the solutions for the learning theory homework on Monday. In general, I hope on Monday by midnight. Because the homework is, the solutions will be late, I mean that basically gives you only a day to go through those things. I will try not to emphasize that part in the exam. Any other questions? There were many questions in my office hours about how to break these parts in that factory, by that something about the robot. And if you have any such questions, you may want to raise them now, or come to office hours, use Canvas. Yes?
I think I saw on Canvas that it was one or more parts per product, but I think we said in office hours that it was 0 or more.
Yes, 0 or more.
0 or more.
Yes.
Okay.
But again, that's a constant.
Just wanted to make sure.
Sure.
So you can have a part with nothing,
You can have a
Nothing.
or an assembly with nothing.
assembly with nothing. Sure.
Oh, so that's included.
Yeah, sure. Does it really make a difference?
No, not that.
Yeah, it makes a difference in the actual numerical value, but does it make a difference in terms of order of magnitude? Either way, mention it. I mean, if you have any assumptions that you want to write to use, write it down in the in your submission. There are some hands raised somewhere here. Yes.
Part is broken down into two distinct parts and there are two parts. It says the original.
No, if you break it and then you glue it back, you don't get back the original one. Think of it as paper rather than I don't know what. Yes, think of it as yeah. You can't gluing back does not give you back the original. Yes. If there are no other questions, we're going to continue where we left off. So, towards the end of the last lecture, we basically at the end of the last lecture we looked at agnostic learning setting, and we saw a sample complexity bound on how many examples are needed for the case where your hypothesis class does not necessarily contain the true concept. This is agnostic learning, and a standard agnostic learner, or not a standard, in general, the assumption is an agnostic learner returns a hypothesis which makes the least error on a training set. Because that seems like a reasonable thing to do. You have a training set, try to find a function that has the least error. And the theoretical question is, if you follow this policy, how bad can it be? There are and we derived a bound on this sample complexity, and there are two different ways of interpreting this. The first one is exactly what we derived. With the probability 1 minus delta, your the training error and the generalization error will not differ by more than epsilon if you see these many examples. And while I don't expect you to remember the exact expression, I just want you to notice that it's dependent on 1 over epsilon square. It's a function of the size of the hypothesis space, and it grows logarithmically with 1 over delta.
Here's a question. So these examples have to be distinct.
No, they don't have to be distinct. They only have to be drawn from that distribution.
Randomly.
Yes. We are, again, just to remind you, we are in the batch learning setting. So the train and the test examples are the same, are drawn from the same distribution. So if, say, you have this pathological distribution on the training set, or pathological probability distribution where you may have a big instance space, but all the probability is on the same single thing. In other words, you'll always, every time you make a draw, you'll get the same example. And you pick m of those, which means you get m of the same example. At test time, you're guaranteed to get the same thing because it's the same. So it's okay. So this is one interpretation. Another way of seeing the same thing just by rearranging these symbols and writing down the definition of epsilon, we get a generalization bound. If you are given m training examples, which is what we usually have, right? We have a data set which has a certain number of training examples. How bad can it be? How bad can your true error be if your training error is error s? And what this says is there is a bound in this difference. So your test error or expected error on future examples can be no more than that quantity above the training error. Okay? And notice that the training error will not be 0 in this case. Why? It's agnostic. So in the Occam's razor case that we saw earlier, the training error can be 0. In fact, will be 0. It's defined because we will find a consistent hypothesis. In this setting, there is no guarantee, so the training error need not be 0. If it is, you're lucky. So this is roughly the end of what we saw at the end. This is what we saw at the end of last lecture. Just to summarize where we are, a couple of lectures back we saw Occam's razor. When the hypothesis class contains the true concept, then you need to see these many examples to get the epsilon delta guarantees. When your hypothesis class does not contain the true, or need not contain the true concept, then you get a different sample complexity. They roughly look the same except for an epsilon square term at the bottom. But what it seems is that the learnability of a function, of a concept, depends on the size of the hypothesis space. So how do you use this? You're given a class of functions, you count how many functions are there in the space, and if that is polynomial, if the log of that number is polynomial, if the log of size of h is polynomial, then we are in good shape because we need only a polynomial number of examples. Doesn't mean that we have the learning algorithm yet. You still have to define the learning algorithm that can find the single good one. But at least all you know, what you can say is in terms of information theory, things are okay. Remember we saw in the last lecture sample complexity and computational complexity. Sometimes you may have a case, a hypothesis class where the sample complexity is good, but the computational complexity is not. Sometimes the other way around. Here we are only talking about sample complexity, and in terms of sample complexity, in terms of number of examples needed, seems like learnability depends on the log of the size of the hypothesis space. In both cases, whether or not you're in the agnostic setting. So it seems like we've solved the problem. Right? What's missing here? Why don't we have everything? Have we characterized all classes of functions that can be learned using just roughly some approximation of what's on this slide? Someone speaks. Yes.
So I said there's not the information about the features.
Let's say I give you the features. Have we solved the problem? Yes. If h is infinite, can you give an example of when h will be infinite? Perceptron. Perceptron searches for planes, hyperplanes or lines in n-dimensional space. The size of hypothesis space, how many planes, how many lines are there? How many hyperplanes are there? Infinite. So log of infinite is unfortunately still infinite, so to get any kind of guarantees with linear classifiers, it seems like we need an infinite number of examples. So learnability is, according to this slide, learning is impossible with linear classifiers. And yet, in your homework, you proved otherwise. Right? So what this really means is our theory is not enough. Our theory is not sufficient. We have only looked at the class, so we need different mathematical strategies for dealing with infinite and finite hypothesis classes. So let's look at that now. But before that, any questions about anything that we did in the last lecture?
So do we have lower bounds that are smaller than these two things in theory?
So lower bounds are harder to compute. There are very precious few learning lower bounds, unfortunately. In general, I think it's not just for learning. Lower bounds are harder to prove. There was another hand. Did you have? Yes.
So just a couple slides back where you were talking about the generalization error.
This one?
Yeah. So the expected error, true error, I guess I don't. So do we know that the expected error is always going to be larger than the training error? I guess.
All we know is it will be less than that quantity.
Okay.
In general, it might end up being larger, but it will be bounded by that quantity.
Okay. But is it bounded on both sides? Like
Nothing from here. That was roughly the same question.
Oh, I understand. Okay. I see.
This doesn't tell us anything about lower bounds.
Yeah.
Yes.
At the beginning of the lecture, there was like size I'm concerned with the feature number. When should we use that definition?
Right. So, in some sense, if you think about it, so in the perceptron case, we looked at the number of the bound ended up being a function of number of features. Here, the number of features is missing. In fact, we're not even talking about features here. Why? Because the size of h implicitly encodes the number of features. So let's just take, for example, we looked at a couple of examples of this. If you, for example, look at Boolean functions, or let's say conjunctions. How many conjunctions are there? If there are n features, it's 3 power n. So the size of hypothesis is, or log of that is 3 log n. So typically when you end up computing the size of the hypothesis, you will have to account for the number of features. Good question. Yes. Other questions about this? If not, we're going to move on with this puzzle of how do we deal with infinite hypothesis spaces. And the answer takes us through these fun concepts called shattering and VC dimensions. Yes, I've gone through the announcements, and if any of you have come late, the homework 3 deadline has been moved to Sunday, 8th of March. Get back to infinite hypothesis spaces. So, as I said, the previous analysis, everything that we saw till now is restricted to finite hypothesis spaces. Decision trees, for example. But even in the space of infinite hypothesis spaces, some functions, some classes of functions are more expressive than others. Linear classifiers are, for example, less expressive than other polynomials. Rectangles we'll be looking at the example of rectangles. Rectangles are less expressive than 17-sided polygons or general polygons. So,
I have a question.
Yes.
How do we define this?
That's the point. How do we define expressivity? What does it mean to be expressive? How many different functions can be expressed using this? How many different Boolean functions, for example, or how many
Size of hypothesis?
Exactly. How do we define the size of hypothesis? Intuitively, you would agree that a linear classifier versus a general, a conjunction of linear classifiers, they don't express the same function. We've already seen an example. XOR is an example of a function that cannot be expressed by linears, but can be expressed by other combinations of linear classifiers. So clearly, the set of functions that a linear classifier can express is smaller than the set of functions that a combination of a linear classifier can express. So what we seek is theory that can actually formalize this intuition. What we need is a measure for expressiveness of these infinite hypothesis classes. And it turns out something called the VC dimension, or the Vapnik, I can't even say that name, Chervonenkis dimension, let's just say VC dimension, is such a measure. Just like the size of h, or actually the log of size of h, showed up in the sample complexity bounds, it turns out VC dimension will roughly play the role of log size h. And we'll get complexity bounds that look very similar. So, all I need to tell you next is what's this VC dimension. And in fact, you'll be computing some VC dimensions in your homework as well. So, let's, and typically to define VC dimensions, we end up looking at these really toy hypothesis classes. For example, let's say the target concept is the axis parallel rectangle. What that means is everything inside the rectangle, all points inside the rectangle are positive, everything outside is negative. we want to learn functions, and let's say this is the consistent learning case, so we know that the class of functions is axis parallel rectangle. And let's say we are given some training set, couple of pluses, one minus, and amazingly all the colors look messed up, but I'm glad I used pluses and minus. So you're given this example, you know that it's you can find an axis parallel rectangle that correctly classifies this data. If you had more examples, you'd find a bigger rectangle, sometimes not. If you had more examples, you'd find a bigger rectangle. That's easy. So the learning algorithm is easy. Just find the biggest rectangle that encloses all the positive points. So that part's easy, but so the answer to this question seems like it can be done. But can we come close to the true concept, which is that outside rectangle? So what we want is some way of characterizing the expressivity of these functions. So, for example, what do I mean by expressivity of functions? Let's consider this is terrible. Can you guys see colors?
Not really.
Oh well. I can assure you there is some of these points are red, some of them are blue. Yes. So it doesn't matter. Trust me. There's been this meme about some dress and gold and grey and black and blue. So maybe this slide is like that. So in any case, so let's say you're given 2 points. And we live in this world of binary classification. So there are 4 ways of labeling these 2 points. You don't need to see the colors on the slide to actually figure out that there are 4 ways. And if you want to draw a line that separates the positive and negative, irrespective of how the points are labeled, you can find a line. Right? That's easy. What this means is that linear classifiers are expressive enough to shatter 2 points. I don't care how you label them, I can find a line that separates, that correctly identifies your dichotomy of these 2 points, your classification of these 2 points. This is what we'll use the word shatter to denote this concept. Irrespective of how the points are labeled, given a certain number of points, the set of linear classifiers can separate. So 2 points are easy. I can easily draw it on the board. What if there are 14 points? Let's look at 14 points. And this is where it would have been nicer if you can see the colors. I have labeled the points blue and what looks like black. And yeah, sure, I can draw a line that separates them. Does this mean that the set of lines can shatter 14 points? No, because I can always find a different labeling, and no matter how I try to find a line, it won't classify it. Does this mean that 14 points can never be shattered by any function? Again, no, I can come up with a much more complicated function that separates 14 points. Right? So this is an intuitive definition of expressivity of functions. If I give you a certain number of points and an adversary labels them, can you find a function in your set of functions that can correctly match the adversary? So 14 points cannot be shattered by lines, 2 points can. So let's make a formal definition. You're given a finite set of examples, a finite set of points actually, not labeled. A finite set of points is shattered by a hypothesis function, hypothesis class, if for every partition of these sets of points, there exists a member in this class of functions that can correctly match that partition. It can correctly label the example. We'll look at some examples of how to what this means. But intuitively, a richer class of functions can shatter more points. Any questions about anything that we've seen till now? Yes.
We have gone from like bad to worse. Earlier we were in dimension of the features, now we are in dimension of our examples. right?
Yes.
And we assume them to be large.
Sure,
Basic
sure.
dimension is like it has even blown up the upper bound.
It hasn't, and we'll see why. So let's look at one example, and I'm going to try to work out these examples on the whiteboard. And maybe you can even see the colors on the whiteboard. So one class of functions is what are called left-bounded intervals on the real axis. So what this means is you're given a real line, and this is the origin. And your example points can show up from anywhere on this line. The hypothesis class consists of intervals between say 0 and some a. And what we say is, and basically the interpretation of this is everything inside this is positive, everything outside is negative. This is the class of functions we are playing with. So the question is, can this class of function shatter, or in fact we don't even have, let's assume that we, for now, we don't even have anything to the left of the origin. So positive numbers. So one immediate question is, can this class of functions shatter a set of one example? So what does one example look like? You're given a positive, basically you're given some point. You're given a point. I give you a point, let's say, and I'm trying to ask, can this set be shattered by this class of functions? As an adversary, what you'll do is you'll provide a labeling for it. Let's say you provide plus. What I'll do is find an A that contains this. So let me write it this way. And this function correctly labels this point. Let's say instead you labeled it minus. I can still find an A. Right? Everything outside, remember, everything to the right of that boundary is negative. So this class of functions can shatter one point. Yes?
Why does it have to start with origin?
Just I've just defined it to be that way. This is just a class of functions that we are looking at for now. Okay. So what we know is that this class of functions can shatter one point, a set of one point, which is good. So now let's look at what happens when we get to 2 points. You have a real line, you have 2 points. Okay? So case 1 is when both of them are positive. I can find a function, just put the boundary here. Case 2, when both of them are negative, still good. Case 3, okay? Now, case 3 is when this one is positive and this one is negative, and good. But you are an adversary. You will not pick any of these. What you will do is give me a negative here and a positive here. Right? So, what this means, if I give you 2 points, because you are adversarial, you want to prove to me that 2 points, there is no function in my set of functions that can correctly identify your labeling. What you will do is you will pick this label. Does that make sense? So what this means is 2 points cannot be shattered by this hypothesis class. Any questions about this?
So for the one-dimensional case,
For one dimension?
or the one-point case,
Yes.
not one dimension. If I have a and negative label on 0, isn't that not shatterable?
What?
So if my test point was 0.
Oh, so I pick the point.
Oh.
I pick the point, you get to label. Yes.
But you could pick 0, right?
I wouldn't, because I want to convince you that I want to convince you that this set can be shattered. So I have the freedom to pick whatever I want. You are trying to convince me that no, this cannot be shattered. Okay, let's look at another example. Intervals of this kind. So now let's get rid of this restriction of things being bounded by 0. So the class of functions now is defined by two variables, a and b. Everything inside is positive, everything outside is negative. Okay? So can one point be shattered by this?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, if you give me a point and you give me any label, if it's positive, I'll make sure that the interval is around that point. If it's negative, I'll just put the interval to the left, outside. That's easy. Can 2 points be shattered by? Who can convince me? Yes.
Me?
Yeah.
So you have the same cases as before.
Mhm.
The just having the positive and the negative works for the first 3 cases.
Yes.
And then the 4th case, well, you solve it by adding the negative interval on the left.
Yes. So the only difficulty in the previous one was this case. And we just solve it by doing this. Can 3 points be shattered? Who can give me a counter example? Let's say I have 3 points, P, Q, and R.
Positive, negative, positive.
Yes. So there's no function in my set of functions that can can actually match this. So 3 points cannot be shattered. So you're getting the game now. Well, the real proof is you can enumerate all of these if you want. It doesn't. You don't even have to enumerate. In fact, you just have, as an adversary, you just have to give one counter example. I'll give you the 3 points. You give me a labeling that will cause me to fail. Another class of functions, half spaces. Half spaces in a plane. This is the class of functions that, for example, positron will get you if you are in 2 dimensions. So, again, let's work through the details. Can 1 point be shattered? Can 2 points be shattered? You just draw the line between them, or outside each other, both of them. Can 3 points be shattered? Who says no and who says yes? How many people say no? About half the class. How many people say yes? The other half of the class. Remember, I am giving you the points. So those who said no, can you give a set of 3 points that cannot be shattered? Yes.
If all 3 lie on a line,
If all 3 lie on the line. And how will you label it?
you could do a plus minus plus, just have them alternate.
Okay, that's fine. But remember, I will give you the points. If I have to if I'm trying to convince you that 3 points can be shattered, I wouldn't pick this. Yes.
So I guess I'm not following the adversarial argument because I guess if we go back to the previous example, what if I just don't pick that 4th case ever?
No, you are the adversary. The adversary, I pick the points, the
Yeah, so
adversary picks the label.
what if you always just pick the same 2 points? So I have 1 point that I picked twice. You can always do that, can't you?
But that's the same point.
Yeah.
It's a set of points. The definition requires a set.
Okay.
So the idea is that the I'm personifying this, the person who tries to prove that that D points can be shattered picks a set of D points that are convenient for him or her. The adversary picks a labeling that they believe is inconvenient for the prover. So
we are we are talking about training. We are given a training set and we are trying.
we haven't gotten to the training yet. This is just a geometric concept.
So we just define the space where points can lie. We don't actually define this point.
We don't define the points. We don't.
Yeah.
So the shattering is a property of a number, namely the number of points, and a function. Sorry, a class of functions.
So this is means we can pick this points. The choice of these points will say that hypothesis class will not have.
Yeah, but there's another class of points. There's another. Yes.
But so the question that he asked that can a set of 3 points be shattered? Then the question is not correct. We should ask that can this set of 3 points be shattered? If you are
Sure.
going to give
Yes. Can this exactly? Yes. You're right. You're right. So this set of 3 points cannot be shattered.
yeah.
Whereas I'll give you another set of 3 points. Now anyway, yes.
So, I mean, if we're doing it in...
Can you see what I'm writing here?
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
So if we're doing it in two-dimensional space, you could always, I mean, there's infinite amount of different examples that you could choose, or a set of examples, if we're talking about 2 dimensions.
Sure, but then the question is, how many equivalence classes are there in terms of this? If I pick 3 points, either all 3 of them lie on a line, or they don't. Right? If they lie on a line, that set cannot be shattered. If they don't, they form a triangle. Can the triangle be shattered, is the question. Can those 3 points be shattered?
Yes.
When do you give labels to those points?
Now, once I give you the points, you try to find a labeling that will such that I cannot classify the points correctly. Let's try out all cases. Suppose I label all of these positive. Suppose I go plus, plus, plus. Is there a line that can label this?
Yes.
Yes. Same for all negatives, right? So let's pick a case where 2 of them are plus and 1 of them is minus. I can draw a line because it's a triangle. There is actually a gap between this, so I can draw this line. Doesn't matter which 2 of them are positive and which one is negative, right? What if I have 2 minuses and a plus? Same argument. What if all of them are minus? Yes. No matter how you try to label these points, if 3 points lie on a triangle, it will get shattered. So 3 points, any 3 points, but this set of 3 points can be shattered. What about 4 points? Well, I've already written the answer there, but now with 4 points, you have to, the proof is a little more involved.
So when we say these points are shattered, we take all the combinations of labels, is it?
All possible combinations of labels. For every labeling that exists, there's a function that can correctly match those labels. Now for 4 points, the proof is a little bit more involved. If I give you 4 points, so when I give you 4, let's say I give you 4 points. Again, I can divide it into 2 cases. Either 3 of them lie on a line and the 4th one doesn't. Okay, if all 4 of them lie on a line, it's not going to work. Either 3 of them lie on a line, so the other option is 3 lie on a line and 1 lies outside, so you get something like this. Can this be shattered? Can you give me an adversarial, let's call this point P, Q, R and S. Can you give me a labeling that will force me to That will give me problems. Plus, minus, plus. Yeah. Or plus, minus, it doesn't matter. So if three of them lie on a line, you basically go back to the same argument that you had for this interval thing, because they are on a line and you are effectively trying to find intervals. So the only case left is when when three of them do not lie on a line. So you get something like this. Who can give me a counter argument?
This is just like the XOR.
This is exactly the XOR. So 4 points cannot be shattered. Any 4 points cannot be shattered. By the way, just as a pointer, just as one of the, it turns out the XOR function is often a good answer for what's a counter example for this. It's just one of those annoying functions that really messes up most theoretical, that makes life interesting, let's say. So let me just quickly summarize this idea of shattering. It's an adversarial game between you and an adversary. And if it makes you feel better, you can think of yourself as Batman and Joker or something like that. And the game goes like this. You produce a you claim that a hypothesis class H can shatter these D points for some D. Your adversary says, here's a labeling that will prove you wrong. And then you triumphantly pull out a function from your hypothesis class that correctly matches your adversary's labeling, and that's the proof. Okay? So, questions about shattering?
So I guess I'm still not completely understanding why we're doing the adversarial game when we were saying before that or we were testing every set of possibilities inside of this.
Possibilities of what?
Of my example set X, right? Is the definition.
No. The definition says a set of examples, and every set of
It's shattered by every partition of the
every
example.
partition, which is basically a partition between plus and minus, which is every labeling.
Okay, so okay.
Typically in adversarial proofs, every time you see there exists, you put yourself on that side. Every time you see a for all, you put your adversary there. Yes.
In our case, we can only take a line as a reference class. We cannot take an interval.
What is our case?
So this is shattering.
No, you're given a hypothesis class. It just so happens that, so we're trying to study classes of functions. If it so happens that you're interested in the class of intervals, then
That's a one of my function is an interval. Can I take it in my hypothesis class?
what does that mean? One of your functions is an interval. Are all your functions?
All my functions.
That's a hypothesis class. What's a hypothesis class? It's a set of functions that you're searching over. Nothing says that you should search over only lines. In fact, the example I started off with was axis parallel rectangles, which if you may be interested now in trying to figure out whether axis parallel rectangles can shatter, say, 2 points or 3 points. In fact, let's no, I won't be working through that example, but maybe it will show up in your exam. Here's another interesting thought experiment. It turns out some functions can shatter infinite points. No matter how many points you give, no adversary can label those points in such a way that it can be fooled. We've already seen an example of a class of functions that can shatter infinite points. This is the class of functions that one nearest neighbor searches over. And the intuition here is no matter what your class of data, no matter what function you have, if you remember from our lecture on nearest neighbors, any function can be learned with nearest neighbors. So it's expressive enough to capture anything you want. Which is, it may seem like a very cool thing, but we'll see in a little bit, and I already kind of hinted at this. Actually, no. Let's get back to that. Let's get back to yes.
So is expressiveness measured as an interval between 0 and 1 by, so is it measured numerically, or?
It's measured using the VC dimension, which basically is the maximum number of points that can be shattered.
Okay.
So just this point about bias. So if you what's it? When can your shattering dimension be infinite? If an arbitrarily large number of points can be shattered, arbitrary, meaning it can for all n, then by the definition of its VC dimension is defined to be infinite. That we haven't defined what VC dimension is, so this slide came a little too early. But one thing that I want to point out is that if your hypothesis space is unbiased, it's said to be unbiased if it can induce any possible labels to your data. Think of it as, we have not talked about bias invariance yet, so think of this as a definition. If it is less biased, it's more biased if a smaller number of points can be shattered. So remember the first example that we saw, the set of functions which are defined by. You are introducing a lot of knowledge if you believe that this is the only set of functions you need to search over. So if your number of points that can be shattered is small, that means you are actually introducing a lot of bias in your choice of your hypothesis space. If the number of points that can be shattered is infinite, that means it's defined to be unbiased. You have no idea what's going on, you're just going to try to find any function that fits. And we'll come back to this point once we'll talk about bias and variance and such things once maybe after the spring break actually. But at this point, let me define the VC dimension, the Vapnik-Chernykov dimension. You are given a hypothesis space, H. The VC dimension of H is defined to be the size of the largest finite set of points that can be shattered by that class of functions. So if, for example, there is some set of points whose size is d that can be shattered, then the VC dimension of that class is at least d. If no set of points with that given size can be shattered, like 14 points cannot be shattered by a line, 100 points cannot be shattered by linear classifiers. What that means is VC dimension of linear classifiers is less than 100, it's less than 14. Okay? So what we've got is effectively, in the last say 20 minutes, we managed to prove a few things. The VC dimension of half intervals, I just call these half intervals. The VC dimension of half intervals is 1. There is a data set, a collection of points of size 1 that can be shattered. There is no collection of points of size 2 that can be shattered using half intervals. So by definition, the VC dimension of half intervals is 1. For full intervals, or just intervals, which are defined by two numbers, there is a collection of points of size 2 that can be shattered. What that means is VC dimension of intervals is at least 2. Now you also need to prove the other side. There is no collection of points of size 3 that can be shattered. We did actually prove it. So VC dimension of, so effectively the proof for the VC dimension goes like this. There exists S such that size of S equals 2, such that S can there exists some data set S such that it can be shattered. This implies VC dimension of H is less than or equal to 2. For all s, sorry,
Larger.
greater, yes. Yes. For all s which has 3 elements, s cannot be shattered by h by, what are you looking at? Intervals. S can shattered. This means well, we put these two together, you know that VC dimension is defined to be the maximum number of points that can be shattered. So this proves that VC dimension of intervals is 2. Questions?
The biasness is towards that particular concept where this class now. It's not towards the particular labels, right? Positive class samples or negative class.
No, it's a word of class of functions. Yes.
So we're saying that the instance space X can be shattered by H, not specifically because you're saying that there exists an S in
Yes.
X, so X is being shattered by H.
X is being shattered.
Okay.
No, the set of points S is being shattered,
Okay,
not the instance space.
I see. So can you say that X can be shattered by
X is an infinite set. So
Okay.
then we are back to the problem of it's not going to work. Look at the definition of the largest finite
Mhm.
subset of X. So X is this. In general, we are looking at infinite hypothesis spaces. So the subset of size of X is infinite. So we can't deal with it.
I was just wondering, relating to what she said with how you just end up with different classes, like 3 points that are on a line or 3 points that form a triangle,
Mhm.
right? So one of those can be shattered and one of those can't be shattered.
Yes. So all you need
can you
is
say that the space of all 3 points can't be shattered by H?
we don't care about all 3. Oh, in
Okay.
this case, for this intervals,
No.
for
So if just back to the example, you have 3 points, you're shattering them with a straight line.
oh, you're talking about linear hypothesis. Okay.
Yes.
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 Half spaces. Yes. Go on.
Yeah, sorry. So so if you have them in a triangle, you can shatter them.
Yes.
But if you have the 3 in a line,
You cannot.
can't. So can you say? I mean, can you say that the set of any 3 points can't be shattered by a line?
The set of any 3 points cannot be shattered, but there exists a set of 3 points that
Yes.
can be shattered.
I see.
And all you need is there exists.
Okay. Okay.
So all you need is that if there exists some set that can be shattered, then the VC dimension is at least the size of that subset. Sure, of course, the 3 points in a line cannot be shattered, but 3 points in a triangle can be shattered.
So this would be more biased, correct?
Which one?
What we're talking about with VC dimension greater than equal to 2 but less than 3.
Uh-huh.
That would be more biased because
More
it's,
biased than
based upon what you were talking about. I can't remember which slide it was. Yeah, so the larger the subset X that can be shattered, the more expressive it has, so less biased. But so
so smaller VC dimension, more biased.
yeah.
Yes. Correct. Other questions?
More bias towards what?
More biased as in you're making more assumptions about the set of functions. You believe that the set of functions, even though it's an infinite set, both are infinite. The one with the smaller VC dimension is less expressive. So you believe that a lesser expressive function class is sufficient. That's your learning bias.
You mean there are more constraints on the functions in the hypothesis?
Yes. In the case of finite hypothesis space, we could actually enumerate functions. And we could say that there are fewer conjunctions than Boolean functions because we could just count them. Here we can't count them, but we can actually say that some groups of functions like half intervals are less expressive than intervals because they can express fewer concepts. So even though the number of functions is infinite, the number of partitions that these half intervals can induce is smaller than the number of partitions that intervals can induce. Other questions? At this point, what I expect, maybe not at this point, but by this week, I expect you to be able to identify the VC dimension, actually prove this way, the VC dimension of some simple concept classes, say rectangles, axis parallel rectangles, or these things. And some other things that we are not going to prove, but I just want you to know or be aware of. We've looked at linear classifiers in 2 dimensions, and its VC dimension is 3. In general, the VC dimension of a linear classifier in d dimensions is d plus 1. Okay? We've not talked about neural networks, multi-layer neural networks. It turns out before we get to neural networks, for a linear threshold unit in d dimensions, how many parameters have to be learned? D plus 1. So in this case, the VC dimension is actually the number of parameters. So in the case of neural networks, multi-layer neural networks, its VC dimension, it turns out, is also the number of parameters that are being learned. And that should be your worry when you have what are called really deep neural networks. When the number of parameters goes out of bounds, its VC dimension becomes huge. If VC dimension becomes huge, it can express pretty much any function, which means learning becomes more problematic. In particular for neural networks, typically we've not talked about neural networks at all, so this is just for people who know what I'm talking about. In general, it means that you may not be able to find the best parameters because learning is a difficult problem. One nearest neighbors I mentioned, the VC dimension of one nearest neighbors is infinite, because for any point, any set of points, there is a one nearest neighbors hypothesis that can correctly label it. As an exercise, I want you to try to prove it. It's not a very difficult proof. And I'll let you think about it, and maybe someone can tell me in the next class. The intuition in general is a rich set of functions can shatter more points. That's the basic thing. A rich set of functions has a higher VC dimension. So if learning is search over a set of functions, on one hand, we want to be able to shatter as many points as we can, or classify as many, or identify as many partitions of the data as we can. On the other hand, we also want to limit our search space. So this is the tension that we have, and which means we can actually now start thinking about sample complexity in terms of VC dimensions. Before going ahead, any questions? And I don't expect you to be able to prove this except for this last one. Yes?
In one nearest neighbors, the adversary considers that when it is giving out the labels, it considers the cases of nearest neighbors.
No, the adversary doesn't know what your hypothesis class is. Well, it could, because it tries to prove you wrong. So it will use that information. When you're building the adversarial argument, you have to use that. But effectively, the claim is if I give you n points for any n, as an adversary, you will never be able to find the labeling of those points such that my one nearest neighbor classifier on those n points will not get the labeling right. And that's true for all n. That should be the way you prove this as well. Yes?
So does VC dimension directly correspond to the accuracy of your classifier?
No, actually that's a very good question, because that brings me to the next slide. Why VC dimension? Okay, this is cool. It seems like a fun, exercise, and putting points on the whiteboard and trying to classify them and play this Batman and Joker game. But why bother? So let's go back to sample complexity. When we were talking about sample complexity of finite hypothesis spaces, we looked at two cases: consistent classifiers and agnostic learning. And in both cases, the sample complexity depends on the log of the size of the hypothesis space. Effectively, the reason VC dimension is interesting is because VC dimension behaves, and I'm not going to prove this at all, so I just want you to know this piece of information. The VC dimension behaves like this quantity, log of size of hypothesis. So it gets us sample, the m, the number of examples you need to make those epsilon delta clear. So just to make this more concrete, in the Occam's razor setting, when you have consistent classifiers, you can say, suppose you have, if your hypothesis space is infinite, then given a sample, an example data, a data set D with m examples, if you find some hypothesis that's consistent with all those m examples, remember this is the consistent learning case, and if the number of examples m is more than this quantity, again, this quantity is a function of, it turns out it's more complicated in terms of epsilon. It's a function of epsilon log, 1 over epsilon log 13 over epsilon. It's also a function of log of 1 over delta. And where we had log of the size of the hypothesis space, we have a VC dimension. If this condition is true, if you have these many examples and your hypothesis that you produce, your learning algorithm produces is consistent, then there's a probability of at least 1 minus delta that it will have an error less than epsilon. And if this number m is polynomial in all these quantities, in particular it's polynomial in epsilon and delta, so they are good, or 1 over epsilon and 1 over delta. If it's polynomial in the size of the VC dimension, then it means that we have a pack learning. The concept is pack learning. Of course, you need to now give, if there is pack learnable, then you need to then give me a learning algorithm that's efficient. So the other thing that you need to notice here is, actually, how do you use this? How do you use this? Same way you use the size of the hypothesis before. Earlier, if I gave you a concept class, you will find the size of the hypothesis, find that it is log of that is polynomial, and tell me it's good. Now all you need to do is I'll give you a hypothesis class like this one. You will tell me its VC dimension, let's say. You will tell me its VC dimension by this proof is 2. Now you plug in the number 2 here and tell me that there is a polynomial. And so this class of functions is pack learnable. This is the consistent learning case. What about in the agnostic case? Roughly same story. And here I've written the other view of looking at these numbers. And there's a good reason why I wrote it this way. If you have an example, just to kind of tell you that this kind of an expression can be rewritten in terms of by just expanding out the epsilon. Yes?
How does knowing the VC change it from being unlearnable to,
If your VC dimension was infinite,
then it would still be,
then you cannot make this guarantee. If your VC dimension is infinite, then there is no guarantee that with probability 1 minus delta, in the future your error will be less than epsilon. So that tells you something about 1 nearest neighbors. Other questions? Similar story with, go ahead.
We could get that from log of h as well.
What is log of h for this set? It's an infinite set. That was the problem we started with. Effectively, this is what we have kind of conversed upon. Think of VC dimension as a surrogate for log of h, log size h. It's a complexity measure that tells you the expressiveness of a function, a set of functions, and that plays a big role. In the agnostic case, the bound is a lot more ugly. I couldn't write this down. I don't expect you to be able to prove this, but I just want you to notice that there exists a bound that looks a lot like the one that we saw before. Agnostic learning, what does it mean? There is no function in your hypothesis space that's consistent with your entire training set. So there is a non-zero training error. And what we have is the true error, the generalization error on future examples with high probability will be less than training error plus this ugly thing. And that thing is just a function of the VC dimension. Earlier we had this, there was some log of size of h here. And now we have VC, it's polynomial roughly in VC. Same story. If your VC dimension is finite, all's good. The concept class is learnable. If your VC dimension is infinite, same problem, even in the agnostic case. One thing that you should probably think about, in fact, right now, are one nearest neighbors agnostic? Is the one nearest neighbor learning algorithm an agnostic learner? Will the training error ever be 0 or non-zero?
Training error is not 0.
Why not?
Because we, again, if we put the training example, we'll again set the nearest neighbor and it may not be the
How can, what's the nearest point to itself?
So if we are seeking k nearest neighbors, so we'll
One nearest neighbors.
one nearest neighbor is
What's the training error? 0. Always. So one nearest neighbor fits into this expression. It's not agnostic. It's a consistent learner. So, any questions about why VC dimension is interesting? Yes.
So would a larger VC affect like how tight the bound is when we're trying to look at the number of training sets?
Yes, it does, right? Because if you have a larger VC, this expression becomes bigger. So you will end up, you have lesser certainty over the quality of it. There was another hand somewhere here. Yes.
So I didn't quite get why the nearest neighbor is not agnostic. I thought maybe it is because of that definition of the distance is.
It has nothing to do with the definition of distance. Let's say you have a training set that looks like this. You have a plus, plus, and a minus. This is your training data. Okay. Now you train a one nearest neighbors classifier. What's the hypothesis in a one nearest neighbor classifier? People are murmuring. Speak up. Shout out the answer if you know it. Come on, I've been talking to you, it's okay. Talking loud doesn't hurt. Go ahead.
Is it basically the label of the particular point is equal to the label of its closest neighbor?
You're overthinking it.
Uh,
The hypothesis class, the hypothesis in one nearest neighbors is simply you just remember the labels of all the points. Remember, training in nearest neighbors was trivial. There was no training. Just if your points come in a database, you're done. If your points don't come in a database, put it in a database. And at test time, you just go over every point. How do you predict? Given a new point, you find its nearest neighbor and take the label. What's the error of a one nearest neighbor classifier on this point? What's the label of the one nearest neighbor classifier on this point? If you are given a point x, the label would be, let's say your training set looks like xi. You find this point and find its label. But if you are given the point xi, its minimizer would be the point itself, because we are looking at points from the training set. So the nearest neighbor to this point is itself, and the label of that nearest neighbor is the true label of that point. So you'll never make a mistake. Does that make sense?
So, although generally that's the case, I mean, you could potentially define some bad distance function that changes that, right?
Why? The distance function has to be a metric.
Right, it's a metric, but what if I just did something like really bad metric, right? If I did,
Sure. Let's assume for now it's not a pathological case.
So did you say the VC dimension for k or one nearest neighbor is infinity?
Yes.
So how does that equate to
That means that
0?
0
Did you say
infinity. So this actually for nearest neighbors you will not be. It's not the agnostic setting. It's this one. And now you can rewrite the same thing by pulling the epsilon out. There's the epsilon log inside. It's just uglier. But I plug this in here. This number is infinity. So the number of examples you need to make this statement is infinite. And if you remember, we kind of hinted at a similar statement when I talked about nearest neighbors. In the limit, no classifier can be as good as the nearest neighbor classifier. But that's a ridiculous statement. If you have infinite points, then you're done. That's this is saying something similar. Other questions? Yes. K-nearest neighbors gets more complex. This is why think about it, and you can ask me questions maybe after the class or offline. So let me just someone said something. One exercise is if you have a finite hypothesis class, this may even be in your homework, I'm not sure. If you have a finite hypothesis class, what's its VC dimension? And I'm not going to give you the answer because if it's in the homework, that ruins it. Another thing that you should be able to do is the homework 3 asks you to compute the VC dimension of some small function classes, and you basically go over the same procedure that we did. Pick a certain number of points, show that it can be shattered, actually pick a representative, a collection of those points, show that it can be shattered, which means VC dimension is at least that much. Go up one more, and I assure you that for all the homework questions that I gave you, I'm not going to make you try out every case from 1 to 300. Some small number.
So there is something, when we want to say that the VC dimension is something, we need to find at least an example to show that this number of samples can be shattered by this
Function. Yes.
Yeah. So what if, should we really mathematically say that, or what if we just can't produce the exact number of that, or what if we do? Then, for example, we will be able to say that for m number of points it can shatter, but actually it is for a larger number. So
right. So the proof for VC dimension requires both a positive statement and a negative statement. The negative statement says for a certain number of points, for a certain number, every set of points which of that size cannot be shattered. So VC dimension should be less than d for that d. So you need to make the proof for VC dimension complete, you need to give both arguments. VC dimension is at least this much, and it has to be less than this other number. And if those two things collide, you have the VC dimension. So for example, for intervals, the VC dimension is at least 2, it has to be less than 3. For hyperplanes, the VC dimension is at least 3, it has to be less than 4. Because we actually, by enumerating all cases of 4, we can show that it cannot be shattered. Make sense?
And we always do that mathematically. Is it possible that we can't say neither of these arguments mathematically?
You could. There are cases. I'll try not to ask you those kinds of things. But yes, there might be function classes where that can be possible. Or there may be function classes for which we just don't know how to prove that. Sure. So that brings us to the end of computational learning theory section of this class. At least 2 or 3 lectures after when I intended it, but that's okay. I like this part of machine learning, and it would be good for you to know all these things. So what you need to know is what's pack learning. Pack learning is a way of quantifying generalization error, not the training error. It's a way of asking the question, can a set of functions be learned? We spoke about hypothesis. You need to know about what to do in the case of finite hypothesis classes. And effectively, the intuition that I want you to carry home is that if the size of function class is finite, then things are okay. If the size of the log of the size of the hypothesis class is good, then the sample complexity is manageable. So you need to know what sample complexity, what computational complexity of learning. You need to be able to derive those bounds and understand them. And you need to play the game that you're already playing in your homework, which is counting number of functions. And today we spoke about infinite hypothesis classes. You need to understand what's shattering, what's VC dimension. And you need to be able to find the VC dimension of some simple classes of functions. And also, the intuition that you need to take home from this part is higher VC dimension implies bad sample complexity, but more sample complexity. Another question that comes up is something that maybe I should have mentioned at the beginning of this whole series of lectures, but for now it's probably better because you understand these things, I hope. Why bother? You can write down a learning algorithm and just run it. And how does computational learning theory help you build a better spam detector? Learning theory helps us understand answers questions like what is learnability, or write down what's learnability in a mathematically precise way. It lets us know what kinds of functions are learnable. It lets us figure out what are the hopeless cases. And it also gives a formal definition of when a concept is learnable. What does it mean for something to be learned? This is the only theory that we know which answers that. Well, one of the two models, because we also saw the mistake-bound model of learning. And there's a pretty neat reduction. Turns out, if a class of functions is mistake-bound learnable, then it's also pack learnable, and there is a proof which, if you're interested, I can point you to. Not terribly hard. So pack learnability is, it's enough to study pack learnability. Mistake-bound came earlier, but pack learnability is the big picture. And there are also some very, very interesting theoretical questions, which I'm just going to ask now and start in the next lecture with this. The first one is this idea of weak learnability. If a concept is weakly learned, what does that mean? That means that there is a function which there's a concept, and I have a learning algorithm which can always give me a classifier whose error is just slightly better than chance. It's half plus epsilon. Does this mean that the concept is strongly learnable? Does this mean there exists a learning algorithm? I don't know what it is, but there exists a learning algorithm which can get an arbitrarily good accuracy. I have a learning algorithm that's pretty weak. Can I boost it up? Another question is, we've seen bounds of this form. The true error is training error plus some ugly term with VC dimension and delta. Can I define learning algorithms that explicitly tries to minimize the right hand side, thereby getting a bound on this? Clearly, in the -1 minutes left, I cannot give you answers to both these, but I can tell you what I'm getting at. The answer to the first question is this idea called boosting. We'll see that in the next lecture. The answer to the second question is this really important concept called structural risk minimization, and directly led to this idea of support vector machines. In fact, learning theory, you can trace the path from questions in learning theory, these two questions, to boosting and support vector machines. And we'll see the first one in the next class. Just to remind you, the homework deadline is Sunday.